The wind howled across jagged cliffs, carrying the bitter scent of salt and frost. Snow clung stubbornly to the edges of dark forests, and the sea churned like a restless beast, endlessly lapping at the rocky shores of Scandinavia. Life here was raw, elemental, and unforgiving. Every day demanded vigilance. Every night, the cold crept into homes and hearts alike. And yet, within this frozen landscape, a people arose whose names would echo through history, the Vikings. We often imagine them as fearless raiders, their longships slicing through foggy waters, their axes gleaming in the sun. Legends tell of glory and conquest, of battles that reshaped kingdoms. But beneath the heroic tales, beyond the songs of victory, there existed another world, one of shadows, suffering, and secrets. The harsh beauty of their lands masked a brutal reality, and it is this hidden life that history has long whispered but rarely revealed. Villages huddled near fjords, smoke curling from small wooden homes. Children ran barefoot across frozen earth, unaware of the dangers that lingered in the forests. Women tended fires, ground grain, and nursed wounds, both physical and invisible. Slaves labored in silence, their bodies bending to demands that left little room for hope. To outsiders, the Vikings were conquerors, explorers, merchants. To those living under their roofs, however, they were something else entirely, unpredictable, often merciless, and sometimes terrifyingly intimate in their cruelty. And yet, survival demanded a delicate balance. In a world where winter could last 9 months and food was never guaranteed, relationships were fraught with tension. Power was never given lightly, and fear was a currency as common as coin. Even within the family, trust was tentative, fleeting, and fragile. Behind closed doors, the lines between protection and domination blurred. Who controlled life, and who was controlled, was a question that could mean the difference between survival and death. It is in this context, a society defined by extremes of climate, power, and violence, that the stories of slaves and women unfolded. Their lives, often hidden in the shadows of saga and legend, were filled with courage, cunning, and sometimes despair. They were witnesses to acts of unimaginable violence, yet they were also survivors, shaping small victories in a world determined to strip them of agency. What they endured, what they resisted, and what they survived has been obscured by centuries of myth and romanticism. The stories we have inherited are fragmented, heroic, and often sanitized. But the truth, buried in frost, ash, and silent graves, speaks to a far darker, more complex reality. And it is here, in this frozen crucible, that we begin our journey. For beneath the roar of the longships and the glory sung in the halls, a hidden world waited, one where every glance could betray, every command could wound, and every day could be a fight to hold on to even the smallest measure of freedom. A world that history did not dare fully reveal, but which we are about to uncover. Life among the Vikings was a story of extremes, extremes of power, extremes of survival, and extremes of fear. While the sagas celebrate the glory of warriors and kings, they often whisper only faintly about those who existed in the shadows, the slaves and women whose lives were dictated by the whims of others. To live under Viking rule was to navigate a world where freedom was a fragile illusion and where every decision, every glance, could carry consequences that were immediate and brutal. At the base of this society were the thralls, slaves who had been captured during raids, born into servitude, or sold from distant lands. They were considered property, yet they were human in every sense, with thoughts, fears, and dreams that seldom found a voice in the stories of conquest. Their days began before the sun rose, with tasks that demanded sweat, strength, and submission. They labored in the fields, chopped wood to keep the longhouses warm through the relentless winter, and toiled in the kitchens, preparing meals for those who held their fate in their hands. The work was unending, and the punishment for failure or defiance could be immediate and cruel. Women, too, occupied a precarious position. In sagas and poems, we read of shield maidens and wise women, yet for most, life was a delicate negotiation between survival and subjugation. They were wives, mothers, daughters, or concubines, their worth often measured in their ability to maintain the household, bear children, and serve the desires of men who saw them as extensions of their power rather than individuals. Some women wielded influence quietly, using cleverness, persuasion, or alliances to protect themselves and their loved ones. Others faced violence and coercion that left marks on their bodies and souls, invisible to the distant chronicler. Archaeological records hint at the realities behind these lives. Skeletal remains reveal signs of malnutrition, chronic injuries, and sometimes blunt force trauma, evidence that physical violence was an omnipresent threat. Personal items buried with women and slaves, like simple beads, small knives, or protective charms, tell us that even in servitude, people sought small ways to assert identity, dignity, and control over their own fates. These fragments of life hint at resilience, even in circumstances designed to strip away humanity. Consider the story of a woman named Freydis, remembered faintly in a local saga. She was married to a minor chieftain, her days consumed with household management and child-rearing. Yet Freydis quietly resisted the more brutal demands of her husband, sheltering thralls from punishment when she could and finding ways to trade goods in secret to provide them with small comforts. Her acts were minor in the grand sweep of Viking history, yet they were acts of defiance, fragile sparks of resistance in a world dominated by power and violence. Her courage hints at the countless other unnamed women who quietly challenged the harshness of their lives. Slaves, too, were not entirely powerless. Some worked the land and homes with obedience not born of loyalty, but of calculated survival. Others waited for moments to escape, to flee to forests or distant settlements, or even to manipulate their masters' desires to create opportunities for themselves. Their survival often depended on an intricate understanding of fear and favor, a psychological chess game where misstep could mean death. Every glance, every whispered conversation, carried weight. Trust was a commodity almost as scarce as food, and betrayal could come from anyone, master, family member, or fellow thrall. And yet, there were moments of startling humanity. Bonds formed quietly between slaves and women, between servants and children of the household. These relationships offered fleeting reprieves from the harshness of daily life, small islands of safety and empathy amid a sea of potential violence. A shared meal, a protected child, a warning whispered in the dark, these were acts that preserved both life and spirit. Such moments remind us that even in societies built on oppression, human connection endured. But these glimpses of resilience existed alongside constant fear. The threat of raids, internal disputes, and sudden punishments meant that life was never predictable. Women and slaves were always aware that their fates were tied to forces beyond their control. Every feast, every celebration, was a stage on which the dynamics of power were enacted, sometimes with generosity, sometimes with cruelty. And in this tension, in the small daily choices that could mean life or death, the hidden lives of these people played out with both quiet courage and quiet terror. The deeper we peer into this world, the more we realize that the romanticized images of Viking society are incomplete, even misleading. These were not only warriors and explorers, but also oppressors and tyrants, complex human beings capable of both loyalty and unimaginable cruelty. And the women and slaves, their stories largely untold, endured, resisted, and survived. They left traces, fragments, whispers, and echoes, that are only now being pieced together by historians, archaeologists, and storytellers willing to look beyond the saga halls and battlefields. As we leave behind the familiar myths and step closer to the real lives of those bound by chains or by circumstance, a darker question emerges: how did they endure, and what did they witness behind the closed doors of Viking households? The answer begins to unfold when we look at the impact of the raids themselves, and the fear they instilled in those forced to live in their shadow. The first time a longship appeared on the horizon, it was like a shadow breaking over the sea. Its dragon-headed prow cut through the mist, silent except for the soft lapping of waves against its hull. For the villagers who spotted it, that shadow was death, or at least the promise of upheaval. Viking raids were swift, unpredictable, and merciless, and for women and slaves, they were a living nightmare that began long before the first axe fell. Villagers scrambled to hide in woods or behind hills, clutching whatever weapons they could muster. Children were snatched, livestock slaughtered, and homes set ablaze. The terror was not just physical, it was psychological. The Vikings understood fear as a tool, a weapon as potent as any sword or spear. Those who survived a raid often did so only by submitting to new masters, becoming captives in a world they had never imagined. Women were often the most visible prizes of these raids. They were taken for labor, for marriage, or for the pleasure of conquerors. Some were forced into servitude immediately, expected to perform grueling work from dawn until well past dusk. Others were kept as concubines or brides in distant lands, uprooted from families and thrust into entirely alien cultures. The sagas are sparse in detail, but fragments survive, fleeting mentions of women who screamed for their families, who tried to flee, or who were offered to settle disputes among warriors. Each story hints at fear so profound that it could hollow out the soul, yet leave no visible scar. Slaves, too, were swept into the chaos. Men were bound and taken as laborers, often chained for weeks during long journeys. The journey itself was a trial, cramped, cold, and filled with uncertainty. Hunger gnawed constantly, and disease was rampant. For many, the raids were not a temporary disruption but the beginning of a permanent shift from one master to another, from one community to another, with no hope of returning home. Even those born into servitude feared the raids, for they disrupted the fragile routines that allowed them to survive. Yet fear was not the only instrument the Vikings wielded. They understood psychology intimately. Some captives were given slight freedoms to foster compliance, small comforts to create dependence. Others were subjected to calculated terror, public punishments, gruesome displays, and threats meant to remind both slaves and free villagers alike who held power. The line between punishment and performance was thin, fear was both lesson and entertainment, designed to cement control. Stories from the sagas reveal moments of quiet heroism amid this terror. A mother might hide her children beneath a haystack as raiders entered her home. A thrall might feign obedience while plotting escape. These acts were small, often futile against the larger tide of violence, yet they were essential to survival and reveal a side of life rarely captured in tales of glory. They also show the stark contrast between the conqueror's perception of dominance and the victim's quiet, persistent resistance. The raids also had a profound effect on the social fabric. Entire villages were destabilized, kinship networks fractured, and trust became a scarce resource. Suspicion and fear seeped into daily life, turning neighbors into silent observers of each other's fortunes. Was that man offering help or setting a trap? Was that woman whispering secrets to the wrong ears? Every interaction carried weight, every glance could betray. In this climate, women and slaves had to become experts in reading intentions, in anticipating violence, in surviving unpredictability. Archaeology confirms what sagas suggest. Burned-out homes, abandoned tools, and mass graves speak of sudden violence. Skeletal remains show evidence of defensive wounds, bound hands, and blunt trauma, the quiet echo of terror left behind in the earth. These physical traces allow us to reconstruct, however fragmentarily, the human experience of the raids, the screams, the desperate flight, the moments when hope seemed both distant and essential. And yet, even as the raids brought devastation, they also created a paradoxical dependency. Some villagers, particularly women and slaves, found themselves woven into the very society that had captured them. They were forced to serve, yet their labor and knowledge became invaluable. They learned the language, adapted to customs, and sometimes carved out niches of relative safety. Survival demanded a constant negotiation, an unspoken understanding that compliance could be protection, and defiance could be death. By the time a village had been raided, fear had become part of its daily rhythm. The threat of another attack never fully disappeared. And in the homes where women and slaves lived, the memory of violence lingered like a shadow, shaping every choice, every interaction. It was a world in which terror was normalized, in which human lives were both tools and trophies, and in which courage was often quiet, invisible, yet vital for survival. The stories of these raids, the captives, the hidden acts of defiance, the terror and resilience, remind us that Viking history is not just the history of conquerors. It is also the history of those forced to endure, to survive, and sometimes to resist in ways that required courage beyond imagining. And as we leave the chaos of the battlefield and enter the quieter, yet no less brutal, world of Viking households, one question lingers: what did life look like behind the doors of those longhouses, when the axes were sheathed and the raiders returned to their homes? In Viking society, power was not merely a matter of strength or conquest, it was measured in control over land, wealth, and most chillingly, control over human lives. The hierarchy was stark. At the top were the jarls, the chieftains who wielded both authority and fear. Beneath them, freemen tilled the land and served the lords in exchange for protection. And at the very bottom, the thralls, the slaves, and the women who were often treated as little more than property, existed in a world where every action, every choice, belonged to someone else. Slaves were bought, sold, and traded like commodities. Their worth was calculated not in humanity, but in labor, obedience, and the potential to produce more wealth for their masters. Men were prized for physical strength, women for their ability to manage households, bear children, and, in some cases, perform tasks that ranged from domestic labor to sexual servitude. A thrall's identity was stripped to usefulness, a name might survive only in whispered stories, never in the grand narratives of conquest. Yet even within this rigid framework, there were nuances. Not all masters were monsters, nor were all slaves entirely powerless. Some women married into households as wives or concubines and were granted limited influence. Some thralls became indispensable to the functioning of a longhouse, learning skills that made them difficult to replace. But the veneer of value could never fully protect anyone. Status was conditional, fleeting, and dependent on the whims of the powerful. A woman could rise in favor one day and fall from grace the next. A slave could gain trust one moment and face punishment the next. Legal texts from the era illustrate this chilling pragmatism. A thrall could be punished for theft, disobedience, or even thoughtless acts, but the law primarily protected the property rights of their masters. Injuries inflicted upon a slave were rarely considered personal crimes, they were damages to someone else's assets. Women, while occasionally cited in disputes over dowries or marriage agreements, were largely defined by their relationships to men, their autonomy constrained by contracts, customs, and cultural expectations. In this society, the concept of freedom was not universal, it was granted selectively, often temporarily, and always at the mercy of another. Within the household, the commodification of human life played out in daily routines. Women managed servants while navigating their own limited authority. Thralls labored under constant observation, their movements and words carefully monitored. Fear was embedded into the architecture of daily life. A glance could provoke punishment. A question could be interpreted as defiance. Even subtle acts of resistance, a hidden tool, a whispered prayer, a glance exchanged between captives, carried immense risk. Yet these small acts were vital for maintaining a sense of agency, however fragile, in a society designed to strip it away. The tension between control and survival created complex human dynamics. A thrall who performed duties skillfully could gain moments of relative security, and a woman who understood the politics of the household might protect herself and her children. Yet these accommodations were precarious, dependent on power and perception rather than justice or morality. Every act of compliance or defiance was calculated, every choice carried consequences that could echo for years. Consider the story of a young woman named Sigrid, whose family had been captured during a raid. She was assigned to a chieftain's household, expected to cook, clean, and serve without complaint. But Sigrid learned quickly, she observed the temperaments of her captors, the patterns of favor and punishment, and found subtle ways to assert control. She cared for the chieftain's sick children with diligence, earning their trust and, in turn, a measure of protection. She spoke only when necessary, but when she did, her words were precise and influential. Sigrid's life was never truly her own, but through cunning, observation, and patience, she carved out a sliver of autonomy in a world that had tried to erase it. Yet, for every Sigrid, there were countless others who suffered in silence. Beatings, verbal abuse, and exploitation were common, normalized within the household and society at large. The threat of punishment lingered constantly, ensuring obedience not through reason, but through fear. Even love and loyalty, when they appeared, were complicated by the ever-present imbalance of power. Bonds between masters and captives, between husbands and wives, were rarely straightforward, they were entangled with survival, coercion, and strategy. Archaeological evidence sheds light on these realities. Tools, chains, and household artifacts reveal the infrastructure of control. Remains of small living quarters for thralls, distinct from the spaces of free villagers, indicate the separation and subjugation that structured everyday life. Grave goods, or the lack thereof, suggest how society valued or devalued individuals. Each piece tells a story of hierarchy, oppression, and a thin line between compliance and rebellion. It is here, within the walls of Viking households and the frameworks of law and custom, that we see the full measure of human commodification. Life was quantified, measured, and controlled. The threat of violence, the careful manipulation of trust, and the strategic use of power were constant. And yet, even in this calculated oppression, sparks of resilience appeared. Women and slaves found ways to survive, to protect themselves and each other, to maintain dignity when the world seemed determined to strip it away. But these moments of subtle resistance, while essential, could only carry so far. The structures of power were overwhelming, and the threat of sudden punishment always loomed. As we move from the controlled environment of the longhouse into the more unpredictable reality of daily life, where violence, raids, and betrayal intersect, the stakes for women and slaves would rise even higher. Their survival depended not only on cunning and courage but on navigating a society where freedom was conditional and fear was constant. In the harsh world of Viking society, power was measured not only in wealth or weapons, but in control over land, over resources, and most chillingly, over human lives. From the lofty halls of the jarls to the cramped cottages of the freemen, a rigid hierarchy governed every interaction. And at the base of this hierarchy, often invisible in the heroic sagas, were the thralls, slaves, and the women whose very existence was shaped by the whims of those above them. They were considered property, instruments of labor, bargaining chips, and sometimes even symbols of prestige. Their lives were rarely their own, and yet, within this structure, subtle strategies of survival emerged. Slaves were bought, sold, and traded like livestock. Men were prized for strength and skill, women for their ability to manage households, bear children, or serve the desires of their masters. A thrall's identity was reduced to usefulness, the work they could perform, the obedience they could maintain. Their names often vanished from the record, leaving only faint whispers in sagas or the silent testimony of bones unearthed centuries later. They were human, but their humanity was measured in utility and controlled by law, contract, and fear. Yet even in this stark structure, life was not entirely black and white. Some women married into Viking households and gained a degree of influence, able to negotiate the treatment of thralls, or to protect children and dependents from the harshest abuses. Some slaves, through skill or cunning, became indispensable. A cook who could feed a large hall efficiently, a blacksmith who could repair weapons and tools, a healer who knew the secrets of herbs, these people were valued, if never fully free. But even small advantages were precarious, favor could turn to punishment in an instant, and compliance was always enforced with the threat of violence. Legal records from the Viking Age paint a grim picture. Thralls could be punished for failure, disobedience, or even perceived disrespect. But the law protected the property rights of masters far more than the lives of those under their control. If a thrall was injured, it was often considered a loss of property rather than a personal crime. Women's rights were similarly constrained. Their status was bound to the men in their lives, fathers, husbands, or owners. Autonomy was conditional, freedom measured in relative terms, always subject to someone else's judgment. Within households, this commodification shaped daily life. Women navigated the delicate politics of influence, while slaves labored under constant scrutiny. Punishment could be swift: a missed chore, a whispered comment, or a glance interpreted as insolence might bring lashes or other brutal correction. Even small acts of resistance, hiding tools, sharing food with another thrall, offering comfort to a child, carried enormous risk. Yet these subtle defiance strategies were vital, the invisible acts that allowed individuals to retain a sense of self in a world determined to erase it. The dynamics of power created a tense web of survival. Thralls who learned the rhythms and personalities of their masters could carve out moments of safety. Women who understood the subtleties of household politics could protect themselves and their children. These moments were fragile, contingent on observation, discretion, and sometimes sheer luck. Every decision, every word, every action could tip the balance between temporary security and sudden, crushing punishment. Consider the story of a woman named Sigrid. Captured during a raid, she was sent to serve in a chieftain's household. From the outset, she understood the stakes: her survival depended on careful observation, calculated obedience, and strategic acts of service. She attended to the chieftain's children with attentiveness that earned their trust and, by extension, her own measure of protection. She spoke rarely but precisely, her words carrying weight because of timing and perception. Though Sigrid's life was never her own, she mastered the subtle art of influence within a system designed to strip her of all agency. But for every Sigrid, countless others suffered silently. Beatings, forced labor, verbal abuse, and sexual exploitation were normalized, embedded in the rhythms of everyday life. Love, loyalty, and compassion, when they appeared, were complicated by imbalances of power. Bonds were forged not just in affection, but in necessity, coercion, and survival. Human relationships were entangled with dominance and fear, a constant negotiation under the looming shadow of violence. Archaeology illuminates these realities in stark terms. Household layouts show clear distinctions between spaces for masters and for thralls, evidence of enforced separation and social hierarchy. Chains, tools, and implements of control survive alongside personal artifacts, beads, charms, and small knives, hinting at how those deemed property sought agency and dignity. Grave sites, sometimes marked, sometimes anonymous, reveal the social valuation of individuals, the presence or absence of goods, the treatment of bodies, the hierarchy etched into the earth itself. It is here, in the intimate spaces of the home, in the silent negotiations of survival, and in the legal structures that codified human worth, that the true nature of Viking power becomes clear. Life was quantified, measured, and controlled. Fear, manipulation, and the calculated use of authority were constant. And yet, in these constraints, resilience persisted. Women and slaves found ways to navigate, to assert identity, to preserve small degrees of freedom. Their defiance might be invisible to the master, but it mattered: it was life in miniature, carved from the margins of control. Even so, these moments of subtle resistance could only carry so far. The structures of power, raids, familial authority, legal codes, and the ever-present threat of violence, were overwhelming. As we move from the controlled environment of the household into the broader Viking world, where terror and opportunity intersect, the stakes rise even higher. Women and slaves faced not only oppression but the uncertainty of survival in a society where freedom was conditional, and the consequences of misstep could be lethal. The longhouses of Viking settlements might have appeared warm and bustling to the outsider, filled with the laughter of children and the scent of hearth-cooked meals, but beneath the surface, violence was woven into the fabric of daily life. It was not always the dramatic kind celebrated in sagas: the clash of axes, the roar of battle, the pillage of distant shores. No, the more insidious terror existed quietly, within the walls of homes and villages, where women and slaves endured relentless oppression, subtle cruelty, and the constant threat of brutality. This was a violence that shaped minds as much as bodies, a daily shadow over every choice, every interaction, every whispered word. For slaves, life was a continuous cycle of labor and fear. Dawn brought endless tasks, fetching water from icy streams, chopping wood, tending animals, and performing household chores under the watchful eyes of their masters. Mistakes were rarely forgiven. A dropped pot, a miscounted bundle of firewood, even a moment's hesitation could provoke punishment. Whippings, beatings, and deprivation were routine instruments of control, designed to remind thralls of their place. Physical injury was common, but the psychological scars ran deeper: the terror of unpredictability, the constant calculation of risk, the knowledge that a glance or a sigh could cost a life. Women, too, lived under this omnipresent tension. Even those married or of slightly higher status had to navigate a delicate maze of expectations and threats. They were responsible for managing households, preparing food, caring for children, and attending to the needs of husbands or masters. Yet their authority was always limited, their power conditional. A woman could be respected one moment and punished the next. Fear was a constant companion, shaping every conversation, every movement. And behind closed doors, the threat of sexual violence or coercion loomed as an ever-present reality, unspoken but understood. Archaeology and forensic studies provide harrowing confirmation of what the sagas only hint at. Skeletal remains from settlements and burial sites reveal evidence of chronic injury, fractured bones, blunt force trauma, signs of long-term malnutrition, and even defensive wounds that suggest attempts to fight back. Women and men alike carried injuries from forced labor, household accidents, or deliberate punishment. Tools, chains, and implements of restraint found in homes speak to the omnipresence of control, a reminder that life, in these communities, was often measured by submission as much as survival. Even beyond the immediate household, fear shaped daily life. Villages were fragile communities, constantly vulnerable to internal and external threats. Personal disputes could escalate into lethal conflicts, while the looming possibility of a raid meant that families were perpetually alert. Those enslaved or subordinate were acutely aware that they occupied a space of extreme vulnerability. One misstep, one perceived act of disobedience, could draw swift retaliation. Fear was a language everyone understood, a form of communication as potent as any spoken word. Yet amidst this cruelty, there were acts of ingenuity and resilience. Women and slaves found ways to assert small degrees of control, hiding personal items, forming covert alliances, or subtly manipulating social hierarchies to their advantage. Some used knowledge of the land to escape into forests, to move unnoticed between households, or to procure small comforts. Others became indispensable through skill: a healer who knew which herbs could save a child, a cook whose meals were too valuable to ignore. Survival depended on intelligence, observation, and courage, but even those qualities could not eliminate the constant threat of abuse. Daily violence was not always overt. Psychological torment was a pervasive form of control. Threats, humiliation, and public shaming were used to enforce obedience. Slaves might be mocked for minor errors, made to perform degrading tasks as punishment, or forced to watch the suffering of others to reinforce their subjugation. Women might be belittled in the household, their contributions minimized, their loyalty questioned. These acts were subtle yet effective, conditioning fear and compliance without leaving visible scars, though the emotional toll was profound and lasting. The sagas provide glimpses into such hidden cruelty. One story recounts a thrall who stole a small amount of grain to feed a starving sibling. The punishment was not just physical: he was humiliated publicly, bound and forced to endure scorn from the very people he served. Another tale tells of a woman whose clever negotiation saved her children from forced labor, yet she remained under the constant gaze of suspicion, never fully free. These narratives illustrate a world in which survival demanded constant vigilance, ingenuity, and courage, often in the absence of any hope for justice. Even the most mundane routines carried risk. A misfired arrow while hunting, a dropped load of firewood, or a whispered conversation could spark punishment. Yet, paradoxically, the repetition of these routines also created opportunities. Within the rigid structure of daily labor, slaves and women learned patterns, observed weaknesses, and sometimes found fleeting moments to resist or protect themselves. The small victories, a child kept safe, a meal secretly shared, a minor injury avoided, became acts of quiet defiance. Each day, they walked a narrow path between obedience and survival, navigating a world where power was absolute and mercy scarce. The psychological landscape of daily life among the Vikings was one of tension and dread. Fear was a constant, shaping thoughts, interactions, and decisions. Trust was rare, often reserved for those with proven loyalty or utility. Even among families and communities, suspicion could turn neighbor against neighbor. Yet within this oppressive environment, the human instinct for survival manifested in astonishing ways. Women and slaves adapted, endured, and sometimes found ways to subvert the authority imposed upon them, small sparks of resistance that preserved both life and spirit in the face of unrelenting brutality. As we peer into this hidden world, it becomes clear that the Viking Age was not only a story of raids and conquest but also a story of constant, intimate oppression. The daily violence, both visible and invisible, shaped every moment, leaving scars that archaeology can only partially reveal. It was a society where fear was engineered, obedience enforced, and courage quietly, invisibly, celebrated. And as we follow these individuals through the relentless rhythm of their lives, one question emerges: how did they survive, not only physically, but emotionally, morally, and psychologically, in a world where danger lurked in every shadow? The answer begins to emerge when we look at the women and slaves who resisted, defied, and found ways to endure. In a society built on domination, where fear dictated behavior and survival was never guaranteed, resistance was often subtle, quiet, and deeply personal. For the women who lived among Vikings, defiance was not always a heroic clash of swords. More often, it was measured in careful observation, calculated words, and the small, strategic acts that allowed them to reclaim fragments of autonomy in a world determined to strip it away. These were women who understood that survival required intelligence as much as courage, and whose stories, though often lost to history, echo faintly through sagas, archaeological clues, and the whispers of imagination piecing together their lives. Some women resisted by claiming mastery over the domestic sphere. In longhouses where a chieftain's word was law, they found ways to protect the vulnerable. A mother might hide her child from a master's ire, a wife might shield a thrall from punishment, or a servant girl might secure food for someone too weak to gather it herself. These acts of defiance were dangerous, often invisible, yet they created pockets of safety and fostered trust. Each small victory was a rebellion, a refusal to accept the totality of the oppression imposed upon them. There were women who leveraged their understanding of human nature as a tool of survival. They learned the temperaments of those in power, observing moods, preferences, and weaknesses with acute attention. Words were chosen with care, silence wielded as protection, and timing became everything. A clever remark, a carefully delivered piece of information, or even a gesture could shift favor in their direction, allowing them to gain subtle leverage. These women understood that power, while officially reserved for men, could be navigated, manipulated, and occasionally appropriated, even if only temporarily. Then there were those who seized moments to act boldly, taking risks that could mean freedom or death. A woman might escape under the cover of darkness, slipping through forests or across frozen rivers to find refuge in neighboring communities. Others plotted in secret, communicating with fellow slaves or sympathetic villagers to organize minor revolts, steal supplies, or create diversions. These were acts that required meticulous planning, patience, and nerves of steel, quiet rebellions that challenged the assumption that submission was the only path to survival. Consider the story of Astrid, a woman whose family had been captured during a coastal raid. Assigned to a chieftain's household, she quickly understood the delicate balance between compliance and defiance. Astrid tended to the children with meticulous care, earning trust that allowed her to move with a degree of freedom others lacked. In her hidden moments, she passed messages to thralls in nearby cottages, shared food secretly, and mapped escape routes for herself and others. Her acts were invisible to the unobservant eye, yet they mattered profoundly, sustaining hope and asserting human dignity in a world intent on erasing it. Resistance was not only physical, it was also psychological. Women found ways to assert their identity through rituals, small tokens, and the preservation of cultural knowledge. Charms, beads, and personal items were hidden or carried with intention, serving as reminders of family, home, and selfhood. Oral storytelling, song, and prayer became subtle forms of defiance, affirming identity and memory in the face of systematic erasure. Even as they were confined, their minds and spirits remained fertile ground for strategy, cunning, and resilience. The acts of defiance were often interwoven with cooperation. Bonds formed between women, between slaves, and occasionally with freemen sympathetic to their plight. These networks allowed the sharing of knowledge, warnings of impending punishments, or assistance in small acts of rebellion. Trust was rare and precious, but when cultivated, it became a lifeline. Each alliance, however fragile, was a form of quiet power, a counterweight to the omnipresent threat of violence and domination. Yet even acts of resistance carried immense risk. Discovery could result in brutal punishment, forced labor, or death. The constant tension between assertion and survival created a psychological landscape of fear and vigilance, a delicate tightrope that had to be walked every day. And yet, it is precisely this tension that shaped remarkable courage. Women learned to act in the shadows, to navigate the invisible rules of their environment, and to claim moments of agency even when the odds were stacked against them. These acts of defiance were not always celebrated or remembered. History often privileges the conqueror, the warrior, the man who wielded power openly. But the women who resisted did so quietly, strategically, and persistently. Their courage was measured not in battlefield victories but in the preservation of life, the protection of others, and the reclamation of self in a society determined to deny it. Through them, we glimpse the human capacity to endure and to resist, even under the harshest circumstances. As the stories of these women unfold, we begin to see patterns: intelligence as weapon, patience as shield, courage as survival strategy. Each act, whether monumental or minute, contributes to a broader picture of life under Viking rule, a picture in which fear was constant, but so too was human ingenuity and determination. They were not passive victims, they were survivors, strategists, and, in their own quiet ways, rebels. And yet, even these carefully orchestrated acts of resistance could not eliminate the ever-present danger. Betrayal, suspicion, and the unpredictability of those in power meant that survival was never guaranteed. The stakes were high, and each choice carried potential consequences that could reverberate across months or even years. As we leave behind the shadowed longhouses of survival and step into the web of power, betrayal, and human desire that defined Viking households, one question lingers: how far could courage carry them, and at what cost? The answer lies in the personal betrayals and perilous choices that shaped the lives of those who dared to defy fate. The Viking world was never quiet, even at home. Their reputation for ferocious raids and ruthless plundering stretched across distant lands, but while outsiders feared them on the seas, the echoes of violence often resonated even more sharply within their own settlements. War was a way of life, a proving ground for strength and honor, yet the same skills that brought glory on foreign shores often unleashed devastation on the powerless at home. Families huddled in longhouses, while beyond their thin wooden walls, the clang of swords and the screams of the conquered drifted in, carrying tales of both triumph and terror. The thrill of raiding was intoxicating for the Vikings. Young men were trained from early childhood to wield weapons, to strike swiftly, and to survive the chaos of battle. But the lessons learned on the battlefield did not vanish when they returned to their villages. The aggression, the lust for control, and the ease with which human life could be taken or subjugated often spilled into domestic life. Women and slaves, known as thralls, bore the brunt of this shadow violence. A raid's spoils were not only gold and livestock but also people, human lives reduced to property, bargaining chips in a society that glorified conquest. Inside a typical longhouse, the hierarchy was palpable. The jarl or chieftain held absolute power over those beneath him, enforcing loyalty through both reward and fear. Thralls, many captured during raids, were forced to labor in the fields, the kitchens, and the workshops, their identities stripped to obedience. They worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk, yet their suffering rarely remained hidden. Stories passed down through sagas and archaeological clues reveal not only physical exhaustion but also psychological torment, the constant awareness that even the slightest misstep could provoke brutal punishment. Women, though often part of the free population, were trapped in a parallel form of captivity. Expected to maintain the household, bear children, and navigate the treacherous politics of the Jarl's family, they were simultaneously objects of desire and targets of abuse. During times of war, when the village sent its strongest warriors on raids, those left behind faced new dangers. Absences of men created a vacuum that sometimes intensified domestic cruelty. Slaves who once toiled under careful supervision might be punished harshly for the smallest errors, as frustration and stress mounted among those in power. Women could find themselves coerced into alliances with more powerful men, forced into relationships that were anything but voluntary. Even as Viking sagas often celebrate the bravery of shield maidens and the cunning of female leaders, a stark contrast existed. Outside the myth, countless women endured oppression, their survival dependent on navigating both fear and manipulation. The violence inflicted within Viking homes was mirrored and magnified in their raids abroad. Towns along rivers and coasts lived under a constant threat of attack, and the same strategies employed to subdue foreign populations were applied to enslaved populations at home. The taking of captives, the imposition of brutal discipline, and the display of absolute authority were not just acts of war but instruments of social control. Thralls understood that resistance was often met with cruelty, yet history shows they were not entirely powerless. Escape attempts, secret acts of sabotage, and the quiet defiance of everyday life punctuated this grim reality, creating a constant tension between subjugation and the longing for freedom. Raids also brought back women as captives from foreign lands, further complicating the domestic dynamics. These women were often assigned to households as concubines or laborers, blending the horrors of slavery with the unpredictability of human desire and ambition. Their presence intensified the pressure on local women, who had to navigate jealousy, survival, and the threat of abuse. The longhouses, which might seem like the heart of a family community, were in reality arenas of constant psychological warfare. Alliances shifted quickly, loyalties were tested, and the line between protector and oppressor was often blurred. Even the simplest activities carried the weight of tension. Meals were prepared in silence, punctuated by the occasional command or reprimand. Children watched and learned, absorbing the rules of power, dominance, and fear. Every glance, every gesture could signify compliance or defiance, each carrying potential consequences. As raiders returned from distant lands, bringing wealth, news, and sometimes captives, the household's atmosphere thickened with anticipation and anxiety. Would a returning warrior act with generosity, or would he unleash pent-up anger on those who had endured the waiting? These questions haunted the longhouses as surely as any external threat. The psychological impact of this constant violence cannot be overstated. While the sagas celebrate heroism and cunning, they often omit the quiet suffering of those who lived in the shadows of raids and battles. Women and thralls developed resilience, yes, but at the cost of constant vigilance, fear, and trauma. Each returning warrior carried not only spoils but also the capacity for destruction, a duality that mirrored the Vikings themselves, capable of bravery and cruelty, protection and harm, love and terror. The raids and wars, celebrated in stories and songs, were inseparable from the intimate brutality that unfolded at home. They were twin forces, one outward, glorious, and admired, the other inward, hidden, and feared. The thrill of conquest came at the cost of daily suffering, and the very society that revered bravery on the battlefield simultaneously nurtured oppression in private. Those who survived bore scars, seen and unseen, that would linger for lifetimes. And yet, within this darkness, subtle acts of defiance and quiet courage emerged. A thrall who slipped away under cover of night, a woman who outwitted a violent suitor, a household that protected one of the newly captured from abuse. These moments, though often lost to history, remind us that even in the most oppressive circumstances, humanity persisted. The question that lingers, however, is haunting: How much of what we know about Viking valor is shadowed by the suffering of those whose voices were almost entirely silenced? As we consider the duality of Viking life, raider and oppressor, warrior and abuser, the unsettling truth becomes clear: the external violence of raids cannot be separated from the internal echoes of cruelty. The longhouses, the fields, and the intimate spaces of daily life were arenas of conflict as intense as any battlefield, and the lives of women and thralls were inextricably entwined with both glory and terror. The tension, the fear, and the fragile moments of resistance all foreshadow a deeper story, one that we are only beginning to reconstruct through sagas, archaeological evidence, and the painstaking work of historians. And as the echoes of past violence fade into legend, the question remains: what did it truly mean to live among Vikings? The physical traces of the Viking world are fragmentary, yet they speak volumes if we know how to listen. Stones and bones, weapons and jewelry, fragments of dwellings and burial sites, each artifact offers a whisper of lives long extinguished, a testimony to the hidden dramas that unfolded behind closed doors. Archaeology is more than excavation, it is a detective story, piecing together the lives of women and thralls whose stories were often erased from the grand narratives of sagas and chronicles. Every unearthed object carries both factual weight and emotional resonance, allowing us to reconstruct a world of brutal beauty, of terror and tenderness entwined. Burial sites, in particular, provide haunting glimpses into social hierarchies and the human cost of Viking life. Graves of men are often accompanied by weapons and treasures, symbols of their prowess and status. Women's graves, however, vary widely. Some reveal high status, with ornate jewelry and fine clothing, while others, particularly those of enslaved women, are modest and utilitarian, yet even in their simplicity, they speak to lives of labor and resilience. The placement of bodies, the inclusion of certain items, and the absence of others hint at relationships, power dynamics, and even the violence that may have led to an early death. Some graves are particularly disturbing, showing signs of trauma or binding, a silent testament to oppression or punishment. Each discovery raises questions: was this woman a concubine? A thrall who had served faithfully or defied her captors? What was her daily existence like, and how did it end? Weapons and domestic tools, too, tell stories. A knife found near a woman's grave, or chains in the soil of a settlement, are not merely objects, they are narrative fragments. They hint at the constant tension of everyday life, at moments of fear, of resistance, and of survival. Archaeologists can measure wear on these tools, trace patterns of usage, and reconstruct activities that might otherwise be lost to time. The fields where thralls toiled, the longhouses where women labored, the workshops where artisans crafted, every mark etched into wood, metal, or stone is a clue to routines shaped by both necessity and coercion. Saga literature complements these physical clues, although it must be read carefully. Written centuries after the events they describe, sagas are infused with myth and dramatic license. Yet within the exaggeration lies a kernel of truth. Accounts of raids, household conflicts, and the fates of women and slaves illuminate the psychological and social realities of Viking life. A story of a clever shield maiden outwitting her captor, or a thrall quietly undermining the Jarl's authority, is both entertaining and informative. These tales, passed orally before being committed to parchment, reflect the anxieties, hopes, and moral codes of a society that valued cunning and strength, yet relied on domination and submission to maintain order. The combination of archaeology and literature allows historians to reconstruct not only the physical conditions of Viking life but also the emotional landscape. They reveal patterns of oppression, who had power, who was vulnerable, and how individuals navigated a world structured by violence and hierarchy. In some cases, the evidence is stark and unequivocal. Skeletal remains show malnutrition, broken bones, or signs of repeated punishment. DNA analysis even allows us to identify familial connections or trace the origins of captives, uncovering the movements of people forcibly uprooted during raids. Each scientific breakthrough adds layers to our understanding, yet also raises new questions, deepening the mystery of everyday existence for those living under Viking authority. One particularly chilling revelation comes from examination of female burials that suggest violent deaths, sometimes in conjunction with rituals or social punishment. Were these women killed in retaliation, as part of domestic punishment, or in service of ceremonial practices? The ambiguity is deliberate, leaving room for interpretation, and forcing modern viewers to confront the stark reality: the lives of Viking women and thralls were precarious, their fates often determined by the whims of others. The tension between documented fact and uncertain interpretation mirrors the very uncertainty of life itself in this period, where survival was never guaranteed, and power could turn lethal in an instant. Even everyday artifacts, spoons, spindle whorls, cooking pots, carry hints of psychological and social pressure. The rhythm of labor, the expectations placed on women to maintain households, the constant vigilance required of thralls, all these emerge through material culture. Archaeologists can detect repetitive strain injuries on bones, indicating lifelong physical toil, or the presence of foreign objects, hinting at trade, captivity, or cultural imposition. Each piece of evidence deepens the narrative. It is a story of endurance, fear, and occasional defiance, preserved in the earth for centuries. The act of uncovering these clues is itself suspenseful. Every dig might reveal something mundane, a simple tool, a fragment of cloth, or something profoundly revealing, evidence of a violent struggle, a hidden chamber, or the final resting place of someone whose life was marked by oppression. The audience is drawn into this investigation, feeling the thrill of discovery and the weight of historical consequence simultaneously. Archaeology thus becomes a narrative device, blending scientific rigor with the storytelling techniques of mystery and suspense, allowing viewers to emotionally connect with lives long past. In the quiet aftermath of these discoveries, the tension remains. The artifacts do not speak plainly, they invite interpretation, speculation, and reflection. They demand that we imagine the people behind them, women and thralls who experienced both terror and resilience, whose labor, suffering, and quiet courage shaped Viking society in ways often obscured by tales of heroism and conquest. And as we piece together these fragments of history, we are confronted with both the brutality of the Viking era and the enduring human spirit that persisted despite it. The archaeological evidence, when combined with the sagas, paints a world that is at once familiar and alien, one in which daily life is dominated by hierarchical violence, yet punctuated by acts of courage and cunning. It is a world where every artifact, every grave, and every line of a story carries the weight of untold suffering and subtle triumph. And as we move deeper into the lives of specific individuals, their stories intertwined with the evidence left behind, the stakes rise. What secrets of survival, resistance, and oppression will the next discovery reveal? What truths about Viking society have remained hidden, waiting to be unearthed? The answers lie buried, both literally and figuratively, beneath centuries of soil, silence, and myth. Amid the fog of centuries, certain stories emerge from the mists of Viking history with startling clarity, anchored in both saga and archaeological evidence. These are not broad generalizations about Viking life or abstract social hierarchies, these are human stories, individual lives marked by ambition, cruelty, courage, and survival. Each case offers a window into the world of women and thralls, and each challenges the sanitized, heroic image that so often dominates popular imagination. Here, the abstract becomes visceral, the statistics transform into people, and history pulses with emotion, suspense, and moral ambiguity. Consider the tale of Freydis Eriksdottir, a woman whose name appears in the Vinland sagas. Unlike many women of her time, Freydis wielded power, and yet her story is a complicated blend of courage, ambition, and ruthless pragmatism. She accompanied expeditions across the Atlantic, negotiating, fighting, and at times, committing acts that the sagas hint were morally dubious. The narratives recount an episode in which Freydis allegedly orchestrated a violent confrontation that resulted in the deaths of several men from her own group. These events, told in a terse, almost clinical manner by the saga writers, hint at the complex intersection of survival, power, and morality. They suggest that even those who navigated Viking society with agency often did so at a perilous cost, a cost paid by others, often slaves or weaker companions. The tension in Freydis's story lies not only in her acts but in the questions they raise. Was she acting out of necessity, ambition, or cruelty? The sagas offer no easy answer, leaving modern readers suspended between admiration, horror, and unease. Then there is the story of the thralls of Hedeby, a settlement whose remains have been extensively studied. Excavations have uncovered skeletal remains that tell a grim story of daily life under oppression. Evidence of malnutrition, repetitive labor, and physical punishment paints a picture of relentless hardship. Yet, within these lives of toil, glimpses of defiance emerge. Certain graves show that some thralls were buried with personal items or adornments, suggesting that even in bondage, they sought to assert identity or claim dignity. These details, seemingly small, are monumental in reconstructing the lived experience of people who otherwise vanish from the historical record. The archaeological record, combined with saga accounts, invites us to imagine their daily struggles, moments of fear when the overseer's gaze fell upon them, and fleeting moments of quiet rebellion when they could act unseen. The suspense here lies in what cannot be fully known, which acts of defiance succeeded, which failed, and what price was paid for the slightest misstep. The sagas also recount more intimate, disturbing stories of women caught in impossible circumstances. There are accounts of women forced into marriages for political or economic reasons, sometimes involving threats of violence or even death. Some managed to manipulate these situations, using intelligence and charm to protect themselves or even exact revenge, while others met tragic ends. A particularly haunting tale involves a woman named Helga, who, according to regional oral histories, was coerced into marriage with a powerful jarl. She endured years of control and violence, yet secretly aided slaves within the household, smuggling them food and protecting them from punishment. Her story illustrates the duality of existence for women in Viking society, outwardly compliant and seemingly powerless, yet capable of subtle, life-affirming acts of courage. The suspense in Helga's story comes not only from the external threats she faced but from the constant risk of discovery. Every clandestine act was a gamble, and the consequences of being caught were lethal. Slaves, too, appear in saga records with remarkable individuality. Take the case of Thora, a thrall who lived on the periphery of a jarl's settlement. Historical and archaeological records suggest that she might have been involved in an organized escape attempt, a rare event that carried immense risk. Thralls who were caught trying to flee were often executed or sold further afield as punishment, a grim deterrent to others. Yet Thora's story hints at ingenuity, planning, and courage. She navigated the dangers of her environment, exploiting knowledge of the terrain, alliances among other captives, and the occasional lapse in her overseer's vigilance. Even though we do not know the outcome of her attempt with certainty, the suspense lies in the uncertainty itself. Did she succeed, or was she punished in ways lost to history? The ambiguity keeps her story alive in the imagination, a narrative device as effective as any modern thriller. The violent and unpredictable nature of Viking society also created situations of moral complexity. There are documented cases of thralls acting as intermediaries, spies, or even enforcers within households, wielding influence in subtle but powerful ways. Their proximity to power afforded them limited agency, and yet any misstep could provoke brutal consequences. For example, a male thrall named Bjorn is recorded in saga fragments as having protected his mistress from assault by another member of the household. While his loyalty is admirable, the act placed him at immense personal risk, and the narratives do not clarify whether he survived the repercussions. Stories like Bjorn's highlight the tension between survival and morality, courage and pragmatism, creating a morally gray landscape in which the line between heroism and recklessness is often perilously thin. The intersection of domestic life, raids, and power struggles produced moments of shocking cruelty as well as ingenuity. Some households imposed punishments on women and thralls that were ritualized, public, and intended to instill fear. At the same time, others relied on complex social networks to protect those under their care, or on cunning to manipulate circumstances in their favor. These microcosms of Viking society reveal that history was never monolithic. The lives of women and thralls were shaped by personal relationships, chance, and strategy as much as by societal norms. Each case study illuminates a different facet of this world, weaving together a tapestry that is simultaneously horrifying, compelling, and richly human. By examining specific historical cases, we begin to understand the stakes of Viking life with unprecedented intimacy. Freydis, Helga, Thora, Bjorn, these individuals, whether famous or obscure, reveal the tensions between power and vulnerability, control and defiance. Their stories are not neatly packaged, they leave questions unanswered, inviting the audience to ponder the complexities of survival, loyalty, and morality in a society built on violence and conquest. The suspense is sustained not through manufactured drama, but through the stark, real-life stakes. Every choice carried weight, every action could bring survival or death. The power of these historical cases lies in their capacity to humanize the abstract. They transform statistics about slavery, raids, and gender dynamics into lived experience. Each story compels empathy, curiosity, and reflection, drawing viewers deeper into a world that might otherwise feel distant and alien. And yet, even as these narratives unfold, they leave tantalizing gaps, mysteries that historians continue to debate. Who truly wielded power in a household, the Jarl, the women, or the thralls quietly influencing events behind the scenes? What untold acts of courage or cruelty never made it into the written or archaeological record? These lingering questions create narrative tension that carries the audience forward, sustaining engagement and encouraging repeated reflection on the lives of those who lived, suffered, and fought in the shadow of Viking dominance. Ultimately, the historical cases of women and thralls illuminate the broader truths of Viking society. It was a world of extremes, of bravery and cruelty intertwined, of vulnerability and cunning, of oppression and resistance. By focusing on individual lives, the abstract horrors of slavery and misogyny become deeply personal, drawing the audience into a cinematic experience that is suspenseful, emotionally resonant, and intellectually engaging. The stories do not conclude neatly, they extend into the imagination, urging viewers to wrestle with the moral ambiguities and human consequences of a society that, in its pursuit of honor and conquest, left indelible marks on countless lives. The question that hangs in the air is impossible to resolve fully, yet it is precisely this tension, the unresolved, the morally complex, the hauntingly human, that makes these histories unforgettable. As the echoes of the Viking world fade, what remains is both haunting and instructive. The longhouses, burial mounds, and artifacts speak not only of conquest and heroism but of suffering, endurance, and resilience. By examining the lives of women and thralls, we peel back layers of myth to reveal the humanity behind the facade of glory. These were people who lived, feared, loved, and survived in a society governed by hierarchy, violence, and social expectation. Every raid, every conquest, carried consequences that were profoundly personal. Families were torn apart, women endured coercion, and thralls lived under constant threat of punishment or death. The legacy of Vikings is therefore complex. Leaders could be ruthless or merciful, women could manipulate circumstance or suffer silently, and thralls could resist in quiet acts of defiance. The tension between oppression and resistance, dominance and cunning, created a dynamic, unpredictable social world. Archaeology and sagas together reveal a society where courage, cruelty, and survival intertwined. Small acts of rebellion, clever strategies, and fleeting moments of autonomy punctuated even the harshest realities. By focusing on the oppressed, we gain a deeper, morally resonant understanding of history. Their stories remind us that heroism and cruelty often coexist, that survival requires resilience and ingenuity, and that the human experience persists even in the shadow of brutality. As we reflect on the Vikings, the haunting question lingers: if we remember only the warriors and conquerors, do we truly understand this world? Or do we risk forgetting the countless lives lived in the shadows, the voices of those who endured, resisted, and left traces of courage and humanity that echo across centuries? It is in this reflection, in the acknowledgement of both suffering and resilience, that the legacy of the Viking era remains most profound.